Thank you. It's wonderful to be back on the campus. I'd like it to take you to Nepal this morning, and I'd like to take you to a town outside of Kathmandu called Bhaktapur, an area called Bhaktapur. And for a moment, if you could imagine yourself in a small training center made of mostly cinder blocks and brick, and you're inside a room. The windows are not that big, so there's not a whole lot of light, and it's just after lunch. We have eaten dal bhat to our satisfaction. That's lentils and rice. And the post-lunch period is notorious for people falling asleep, so the people that are gathered are going to sing. A young man stands up, and his voice lifts into the kind of singing that comes from his native area of Nepal, from his Tharu people. It has those sort of what feel like quarter and eighth scales that we would say don't quite harmonize, that somehow lilt their way up and down, and his lyrics are in his native language. Baluji. The melody bounces off the cinder blocks. It's beautiful. And then suddenly, he stops. And deep in his throat, a sob emerges, a deep guttural sob, as if he has just broken down or is about to cry. Everybody in the room, whether they were listening or not, suddenly turned their heads to see what's happening, expecting maybe tears, the song to end. But then he picks up the melody, and it goes again. And then the sobs, and then the melody, and then the deep sobs, almost a gasping. Balu is an ex-bonded slave. He's now about 24 years old. At 16, his community was released from slavery. The song captured the first evening they were released. It's the way his community remembers the first night. There was the lilting melody of absolute freedom and the deep guttural sobs of no place to go, no home to be. Their group moved around various parts of southern Nepal until they came to the district of Kailali, which is in the far west. And they arrived at the edge of a forest that had a river nearby. And overnight, they began to construct little shacks. The group that was gathered that day is a group of people working on conflicts about forestry, land, and water. When Balu was 17 years old, his community arrived in this location and were seen by the other groups in that area as encroachers. One evening, his group gathered, the Kamaya, and they said, "These people are about to kick us off this land again. We can't move again. It's been too much." And out of that group, they decided to send Baluji, this 17-year-old. Go talk to them. See if you can figure something out. And I have this image of this young man making that journey into the camp of his enemies. Essentially, the solution was that he joined their forest user group, their community forest user group, the group that protects the forest. He became a member. And in becoming a member, they somehow found the space to open up territory for the Kamaya that had come from slavery. Balu had transformed his enemies into his friends. In 2009, I started a long-distance correspondence with a wonderful woman from Aboriginal Australia, Judy Atkinson. I had read her rather extraordinary volume called Trauma Trails. It documents the long history of generational and even century-long trauma that her people had experienced. When the British colonizers first arrived in their land, they actually referred to Australia as Terra Nullius, a land of no peoples. But for the Aboriginals, this so-called Terra Nullius was what Judy called a story place. Land holds the stories of human survival across many generations. Land shapes people, just as people shape their countries. The aftermath of a silent war lost, never really fought, left a legacy of displacement and banishment. Though perhaps it would be more accurate to say vanishment, to be present but unseen. The plight of too many of our long-suffering indigenous members of our wider family. Judy turned to an Aboriginal term, dadidi. Dadidi is listening, but it's listening circles, to sit in circles and listen. They committed themselves to share beyond words, what in a very different tradition, Saint Benedict would leave for his monks as the first and primary task, to listen with the ear of the heart. Their listening journey went back past recent events of a broken family, past periods of abuse, past addictive alcohol, past grandparents and great-grandparents, into the ancestors' beckon and call, to the place where the very vibrations of birth and earth can be felt. In Dadidi, people story themselves back into place, groping to locate the coordinates of their immediate settings and a lost peoplehood violated in their lived histories. They grope to feel again, to feel like a person again. How many times have we heard that phrase in settings of violence and violation? I want to feel like a person again. The subtitle of Judy's book, Recreating Song Lines, brought into sharp relief the difficulty of this journey. The beauty of the Aboriginals, one of their great gifts to the world, is that they believe deeply that location is found by sonic engagement. Sound. Literally, over generations, Aboriginals sang to locate themselves. They sing at birth in order to know when you're born. They sing as they walk in order to identify the land. And they carry that song inherently within them as a way to have a map of where they are in the world. You may know this through Bruce Chatwin's wonderful ethnography, song lines. At one point in the book, he asks his friend Arcady, a kind of a cultural translator, do these song lines actually function like a map? To which Arcady responded, music for us is a memory bank for finding one's way about the world. Baluji's song came to mind. His very sounds vibrated the heights of this freedom, and his sobs the depths of feeling lost. His cries had a familiar ring, not unlike the millions displaced in Colombia, the lake region of Africa, or the flow away from violence in Mindanao. One afternoon, I asked Balu, and maybe you can put this on a full screen so people can see the whole of his face again. I asked him if he knew who Jackie Robinson was, because he was always wearing this hat. And he said, no idea. He said, I just went into a store and that hat called to me. I liked it. So I went in, I took it up to the counter, but it was going to cost 500 rupees. It's about $4. So that was my month's wage. So I couldn't buy it. But 2 months later, my younger brother got a job in that store, sweeping. 8 hours a day, he swept the outside, the inside. And at the end of his first month, he received $4. And he bought Balu this hat. You see, he said, I will never stop wearing it. I said, well, let me tell you who Jackie Robinson is. And I described this first black baseball player who, in spite of all the odds and the insults, who lived separately, had to move in ways that no one could imagine, broke one of many of our barriers that hold us apart. And Balu, in his Nepali sway head, oh, he said, now the hat has no money value. What happens when we experience even this small little piece of another's story? What is it that we may describe as a kind of felt vibration when you see this face? What is it that penetrates into our own experience, into things we may have forgotten we knew? What is it when we have a connection? What happens when we feel something but cannot easily name it? What is this thing when we sense a shared humanity? I would like to propose this morning that it is the invisible but ever-present vibration of love. I am not a particular specialist on attachment theory. In fact, I had to go running over the last 6 months to catch up on reading and books. My training in conflict transformation, in particular mediation, took me more to Bowen than Bowlby. In particular, Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman. I think there would be a number of people in the audience that may have followed family systems theories. And this would have been something more present in the ways that we were taught about relational patterns. But as I read, as I conversed with good friend Christian over emails, and now more recently, having heard the last few days, I'm certainly beginning to see such an interesting range of points of connection. Conflict transformation and attachment theory, I think, work deeply from a relational center, understanding both people, relationships, and conflict as linked at a deeper level. Conflict transformation focuses less on fixing things than on these deeper patterns of change: power, perceptions, fears, hopes. Sue's description in both her book and her talk about attachment requiring accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement could well describe, without blinking twice, how we tend to describe group process, governance, or decision-making. Dan's scientific description of mindfulness, and I pull now from his book, paying attention to the present moment from a stance that is non-judgmental and non-reactive, that leads to a form of internal tuning in, the foundation of resilience and flexibility. That could have been written in any conflict transformation book about the deeper sense of presence needed in contexts of high anxiety and conflict. But these things were not the ones that tugged and pulled at me most. Something else called out. Something beyond the conceptual bridges. Something echoed. Something resonated. Something vibrated. I first visited Nepal about 8 years ago. My passport says that I have been there 30 times since. On my first visit, I came across a Tibetan singing bowl. And on every one of the 30 visits, I bought at least one. I guess I'm having a love affair with the Tibetan singing bowl. My dear wife might say it's becoming an obsession. They are scattered around our house. I've carried them back for friends and family across at least 3 continents. This singing bowl even made its way as a chapter into the last book that I wrote with my daughter Angie. Book title is When Blood and Bones Cry Out. Journeys through the soundscape of healing and reconciliation. We were interested in sound. And in the chapter that I wrote, I compared the Tibetan singing bowl to the peace process in Somaliland. Dan Siegel might say, fascinating. I was surprised that Oxford University Press, who eventually has now decided to pick up the book, didn't throw it out entirely. Some years ago, I was in this hall with a Tibetan bowl, but I had very little opportunity to tell you why I like it. So let me say a few words, and then I'm going to play it. When we looked at sound as metaphor, we were interested in something that we noticed about all the books written on healing and reconciliation. Almost every author says 2 things in the book. The first is, healing and reconciliation are not linear processes. Then they take a breath and they say, and here are the phases and stages of healing and reconciliation. Now, this is what we would call a paradox. A paradox is not a contradiction. It is about holding something that are two truths that may be apparently contradictory on the surface, but may at a deeper level have a connection. And I think that these are connected. On the one hand, when you are in the midst of healing and reconciliation over deep violation, you know how much it is up and down, back and forth, over and again, round and round, and nothing, always nothing, makes full sense. And if you stand back and look at hundreds and thousands of these, you may discern a pattern or two that you could refer to as stages or steps. What we noticed was that the linear metaphors dominated. So while they said healing is not a linear process, they didn't actually go on to tell us much about the nonlinear part of all of this. Much more was explored about the ways to explain it, the analysis. In fact, it lends itself to great analysis. Analysis really is the breaking down of things into parts, fragmenting. And that was much of what happened. What we decided to try in the book was to write a whole book where all we did was play with non-linear metaphors to explore them. One of them was this bowl. Among the things that you'll find with a metaphor is that metaphor often establishes directionality. Up is good, down is bad, forward is progress, backward is digression, going in circles is not going anywhere. You could take a whole range of these and you will find a certain directionality. What we were after was something that began to look beyond how to go from point A to B. What if the purpose of healing is not to get from point A to B? What if other things are happening? So, before I go to some of the insight that may come with that, I want to play this. To play this, I'm going to move down into the audience because I'd like for you to hear it from the middle of the room. And I'll do it maybe one or two times. I won't have a roving microphone, so I'm not going to say anything till I come back up here. Just, if you will, feel and listen. See what happens in your little experience of this bowl. There are a number of things I like about the bowl. And I'll try to explain a few of these in very short detail. The first is I love the image of a container. The bowl holds a space. It's marked by an edge that has an inner space and an outer space. And the sound seems to be emergent from the interaction of this inner space, yet it moves out expansively. In fact, it could cover the whole of this room. Much of the terminology that we've heard the last few days, if I was to pick one word, maybe two, that most described this was the word safety and security. Feeling safe. It's something we do a lot with around conflict. Conflict heightens anxiety, fear. It often are situations in where people have been deeply hurt, sometimes for long periods of time. They don't feel safe. How we create the space of safety is an unending challenge in our work. I like container as well because it shows a different kind of metaphor. One of them that I like the most is that it feels like the voice is being called from somewhere deep. It's going deep. It's not trying to go from point A to B. It's trying to touch something deeper. Secondly, I love the sound. They have so many varieties. They got almost every note on a keyboard. In fact, the people who are really experienced often will tune these to make sure they're tuned. They're made of 7 metals quite often. They came originally as bowls that the Tibetans would have eaten out of. This one is a little more of a modern one. It has a particularly good sound for a big room, so I brought it this time. But this sound is based principally on vibration. It's where sound comes from. Things vibrate. So interestingly, when you are messing around with the bowl, you'll discover that you feel it before you hear it. And how much of human experience, especially those things we don't quite know how to call or name, how much of our experience are things we feel, but we don't know quite how to say. But sound, because it's vibration, has unique directionality. So think of these terms. You may have just now experienced them. The closer you were to the bowl, probably the more you may have experienced. Sound penetrates. It actually moves through the skin. It touches you inside. It touches you in your bones. You feel it in your bones. It's a vibration that moves. It penetrates. Sound is expansive. So the reason why I went to the middle of the room was that from that location, that sound moved simultaneously around this whole room. We have this phrase we sometimes use for good stereo systems called surround sound. Sound surrounds you. It holds you. And there's something deep about sound. I have a little speculation about that, and my speculation has to do with where Lulu came a few days ago. One experience we've all had in common is that at some point in our life, we were held in a womb where our first experience was one of vibration. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. That vibration touched us, but it held us. If you universally go and listen to people sing lullabies, you will find that lullabies, while very different in potential forms and lyrics and a whole range of things, have a certain tonality to them that is deeply soothing. We feel held by sound. I think it's why sound transports us. We have several of our senses that permit us to move fluidly in time frames. If I smell a good Indian restaurant dal bhat right now, I can feel like I'm back in Bhaktapur. If I hear a certain song, I can feel like I'm in high school again. Some of these are good and some of these are not so good. We get transported. Music has this capacity. Sound has this capacity. If you've ever been in the Middle East and heard the call to prayers, and you hear a call to prayers again, you can feel like you're back in Cairo or Jerusalem, almost instantaneously. Resonance. What you heard was a form of resonance. Now, resonance is an interesting phenomenon when physicists explain it, but basically, the underpinning viewpoint is that what was happening with the circling of the stick is that the vibrations were gathering, and when they found their, this is the physicist term, natural frequency, when they found their natural frequency, then that spike of sound grows exponentially. It's referred to as resonance, form of it. It's a very interesting question for those of us that work with conflict. What's the natural pace? What's the pace a community needs? What's the pace that a person who has committed a violation and a person who has been violated may need? How do we find a place where those things at some point seek and locate their resonance? Of course, I've noted how often these terms come into our field. That resonated with me. That touched me. I felt moved. Did you see the echo of the workshop that we had? There are so many ways that our oral and sound metaphors bounce into the work that we do. I like the stick on the edge. It's very interesting for me to think about being on the edge. It circles the outside edge, this small membrane that touches the inner and the outer worlds. And somehow it lives there, circling. That's its life, to circle. The circling itself I like. The way this essentially works is that this stick is bouncing over thousands and thousands of points of friction. Friction. That's what's happening. They're bouncing over friction. And as they bounce over friction, if you go too slow, very little happens. If you go too fast, very little happens. But when you find the right place where those friction points begin to connect, begin to talk, begin to converse, suddenly it rises again. And when you stop circling, decrescendo, forte to piano, off into nothings. The Buddhists originally would have used this sort of a bowl to start meditation. They say you follow, Thich Nhat Hanh would say, you follow the sound until it disappears, and then you will be in an interesting place. This circling, by my view, is less about a project. It's not a project mode that we're in when we're circling. I think it's more a soul mode. It's about finding some kind of meaningful conversation. We might say that circling, using this bowl, creates the depth necessary, the depth needed for voice to rise. And how often we find in conflict that people are seeking a voice, a sense of voice, a sense of location, a sense of selfhood. One of the interesting things about circling is there are two ways to see it. The first is the more common Western notion that if you're trying to produce something, going in circles doesn't take you very far. So when we use the phrase, we're just going in circles, we usually mean nothing's happening. It's useless. It's a waste of time. Another way to understand circle is that it's coming back and over again, that it's repetition, that in essence, it's ritual. It's not about going somewhere. It's about opening something, recuperating something, touching something again. I kid my friends at Notre Dame who get preoccupied at times with evaluations using a logical framework to show results of the work that we're doing. I say, well, let's imagine that we're funding your Eucharist. Now, if we just were more effective in doing the Eucharist, you guys would only have to do it one time and it'd be over. Why do you keep coming back? Some of you try to do it every day, for crying out loud. Is it not effective? Is it not carrying you where you need to be? Haven't you done it enough now? I mean, come on. Why do we Mennonites sing the same songs over again and again and again? Isn't it enough? What is this? Why is repetition bad? Aristotle says it's a habit-forming kind of thing that can improve things. But when we apply it to a lot of our work, especially in peace building, we tend to fall to this other direction. Going in circles is nothing's happening. But if we understand it as opening space, as what's needed to create safety, at what may be needed to encourage over and over again the rise of voice, we suddenly have a different image. The first time I met Balu was in Kailali. It was actually out in his home little area. We had come because we were starting to look at the question of how conflicts were so emergent in local communities over access to forest, use of water, the land. And we wanted to meet, among other people, we wanted to meet people who were landless, who had nothing. So we found Balu. And when we came to his village at the edge of one of the forests there, they pulled their beds out of the house. They're called cut beds. Cut. It's kind of like our cot, pronounced with a little longer A. It's a four-post frame quite often in that area with roped, no mattress, just ropes that cut across the frame. At night, they sleep on it, but during the day, they bring it out to sit on. So they brought out the cot beds, and we went out under the trees, and they formed a little tiny circle of these cot beds where we started talking about a recent conflict that they had over a piece of land that they were being asked to leave. And as we talked, people started coming. First, there were a few sat on the cot beds with us. Then they started sitting behind us, then around us. 30 minutes, 40 minutes, it went from 20 people to 50 to 150 to 250. And suddenly we had a completely encircled area in that big grassy knoll under the trees of community people listening to this conversation. It got a little scary. Turns out people were showing up were people that some of them wanted them kicked off, some of them wanted in, and suddenly we were in the middle of a conversation that nobody knew was going to happen. But ever since that moment, I started noticing how often my Tibetan singing bowl was showing up in real life. We funded for a while in the work I was doing a thing called People's Forum Theater. So if you can put this in large because they're a little smaller photo, forum theater is often used in Nepal as a way to convey social messagings. So if you had a health message, or if you had a message about HIV/AIDS, or if you had a message about, in our case, the possibility of nonviolent dialogue as opposed to the use of weapons, the possibility of participating in a constituent assembly, the possibility of women being more involved in the life of the community, a theater group would take this and develop a small way of addressing it. They would arrive in a community and they would begin their theater and people would gather, much like you see here. much like you see here, in a circle. They create kind of a forum around it. A typical theater group would get part way through this, and they would stop at a particular point, and they would pull people in from the audience, and they would say, what do we do now? This person doesn't want to let us have this piece of land. What do we do? And then people in the audience start kicking in ideas, and this is how they've used a lot of this theater. I love it. This is real people, real life, real collectives. With Balu and the group that he had become a member of, the Forest User Group, Community Forestry. 14 years ago, 12 men and women started it. Our basic idea was every local community uses wood to cook. 90% of Nepal needs wood to survive. So those of us in local communities should be watching out for our forests, taking care of our forests. So they formed a user group. That's the group that most uses that part of the forest. And they had a long time forming this because the women said, we won't join unless you agree that every local forest user group is half men and half women. Now, we looked all over Nepal. We could not find anybody that made that commitment except this group. 14 years ago, they made a commitment that every forest user group would be local and every group would have half men and half women. And they said, we're going to find a different way to validate leadership. So every local group will, every 3 years, rotate leadership. And they will do that by the local group electing one man and one woman who serve as coordinators. Then that little group will meet with other groups. They'll elect somebody at the district level, man and woman. Then that group will elect them to a regional level. And what you had was a kind of validation process that had to rise up organically from the community. 14 years ago, they started with 12. They now have 8.5 million members. 24 million people in Nepal. Extraordinary. They had two fantastic skills. They knew how to organize, and they knew how to protest. If there was a problem with the forest, they could shut down the whole town. They could shut down the road to Kathmandu. They could do all kinds of things. But they had never fully evolved the capacity to engage those encroachers, whoever they may be, the others that would come into their community areas for land, forestry, or water. So we began to work on a question. Is it possible for the forest user groups, the water user group, the ex-bonded laborers, the landless, to come together and together evolve a way that the community itself holds a conversation about survival issues when they come up? See, the arrival of Baluji's community was not because they were land grabbers. It was pure survival. We started by using the spider and the spider web. Now, those of you that know a bit of my writing can imagine where that first came from, my other obsession in life, the study of spider webs, especially orb webs, and how extraordinary they are in showing us how to think spatially in spaces. How anchor points are often located very carefully by the spider. Only a few lines that connect. How they circle that space, creating hubs of activity and connection. And how they rebuild that 7 and 8 times a day. It's never over. How they are flexible in the way that they build their strings with little coils that unleash in the wind and come back. How they adapt over and over to the changing environment, and how much of that informs peace building in violent conflict. So we thought, well, how would we do this if we wanted to have a mediation but have no mediators? So we started with the idea of a spider group. Okay? Very shortly, a spider group would be If you have a Kamaya, ex-bonded laborers, you have some landed people displaced from the war, you have a local user group, you have the district forest office, you have the local VDC development committee, you have all these little points within the community. The spider group would pull 1 or 2 people from each group to form a small spider. And the spider literally would move around this space, talking to people, engaging them, asking them questions, who they were, what they needed, what was this about, and then focusing, if possible, toward the question of, could we get together to talk? Now, we ran into problems, and part of the problem was what we came to call Balu's dilemma. Because Balu, in the first iteration of this, was one of the members of one of the spider groups. And he came back to one of our workshops and said, I've got a problem, and it's getting worse. Here's my problem. I'm Kamaya. I'm a leader of an ex-slave group, and they want me to represent them. They want me involved in this discussion to make sure we get what we want, and they're worried that I'm involved to do things for other people. And I'm also a member of FECO Fund, the Forest User Group, and they want me to be with them doing this other thing that protects the forest, and now I'm caught between 2 groups and I'm pulled. Right? What do I do? Is it possible to have a conversation where we don't take sides? And which side should I take? That's what we called Baluji's dilemma. So we started thinking about it. The spider group was working in its circling, but the members felt torn. They were made up of individuals from different groups, but as a small little unit, they had to be a microcosm of the bigger thing they hoped to create. So we played around with images. There's a lot of rivers in Nepal. So at one point, we brought in some images of rivers. This one actually came from the Amazon. We could locate similar ones from Nepal, but I want you to give this to me is an extraordinary picture. I think it illustrates so many things we've talked about the last 3 days. This is where the Rio Negro joins the beginnings of what will be the Amazon River, one flowing in from Bolivia, one from parts of Brazil. And you'll notice from this satellite picture that there is a place right here where they join and start to flow together. They start to flow together. And when you look up close from a satellite, knowing how big the Amazon is, this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. This is what it looks like when you're up a little closer. Now in Nepal, they could locate this exact same phenomena. Rivers that had come down from different parts had different kinds of land, sediment, different ways that they entered. And the notion was, how do we create alongsideness? How do we create a space where people flow in a common direction, but each retains their individuated identity, their group sense? That is, that you don't lose who you are, but you add a capacity to provide leadership for the whole, not just your group. They came up with another image, one that was even more provocative. If I had it here, I'd serve it to you so you could eat it. It's their national soup called Kwati soup, K-W-A-A-T-I, Kwati. Kwati is a 9-bean soup. You locate 9 beans and lentils. Every bean and lentil has a different fermentation process, a different preparation process. And when they come into the big soup, each bean has its flavor, but the combination of beans creates a flavor bigger than any one. Kwati. So these were the things we played with. What did it eventually look like? This may not look like much to you. To me, it makes my heart pitter-patter. for a variety of reasons. It took about 4 or 5 years to get this particular group to sit down together. If I was to point out some things that would give you more of a context, I would tell you this is in the district of Kanchampur. It's in the far west of Nepal. This is a conflict that involves landless, Kamaya, forest user groups. There's a district forest office. The people standing here, these were some members like Balu of our little group that had worked for a number of years trying to figure out. It took them, to create this particular meeting, it took more than a year. They are from this community. So the young man that you see standing there is from the landless group, displaced by the war. The young woman you see standing there is from a very low caste group. Her particular caste, a lot of women her age would have been sold into the trafficking, into prostitution. But she became a member of this forest user group, and that somehow gave her a platform, and she had risen in some leadership. So what you're looking at in those two people standing there who are in their mid-20s, opening this conversation in the community, are two enemies. The forest group that felt encroached, and the landless group that's got no place to go. And now they're holding this conversation. This is the question I've been after for so many years. Still don't have good answers to it. How do we create meaningful conversation about things that matter? And how do we do that when we're in a setting where there's been violence, violation, and there still remains open conflict and division? That's our challenge in much of the work that we do. When I first got this bowl, I started asking people who used them to show me things they did. So every time I would go to a bowl vendor, I would ask him for examples. And one time I went to a bowl vendor and he said, "I'm a healer." I said, "This could be good. This could be good. What do you heal?" He said, "Oh, all kinds of things. There are lots of things you can heal with this bowl." I said, "Well, give me an example." He said, "Well, this morning, for example, I had a woman who came from Europe, and her fingers were frozen in an arthritic condition. Couldn't move her fingers. Had not moved the fingers in her left hand for more than 3 years. And so I took my bowl. He had quite limited English explaining all this, so he said, "I'll just show you." He said, I took my bowl. I put a bunch of water in it, warmed it up a little bit, put some herbs in it, made sure it had enough water. And then for 20 minutes, he had a bowl that was bigger than mine. It was a bowl that was deeper than mine. He said, for 20 minutes, I had her put her hand in it, up to the wrist. And I can keep the sound going by making almost the full circle to wherever her wrist is at. And when he started showing me, I looked inside that bowl. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This isn't easy to show on a camera. He said, "Oh yeah, bowls make fountains. They make fountains." He said, I do that for 20 minutes, and when she pulls her hand out of the water, for the first time in 3 years, she could uncurl several of her fingers. I said, whoa. But something else jumped out at me when I started looking. So I got a couple of bowls, and I've been playing with water because, I have to tell you, this notion of natural frequency, right? Physicists put it on a nice graph, X and Y axis and all that stuff. One is frequency, how fast you're going, how fast things are happening, what pace it's happening. And the other is energy. Resonance is energy. And what they say is you could go too slow and it stays real flat. If you go too fast at the other end, it stays real flat. But when you catch the right frequency, it has this spike that rises, which is kind of this ways that things come together, and it produces it's not a U curve in a nice undulated fashion, but it often is much more of a kind of a spike. Dan had a few spikes in his graph the other day that he was putting up, had a little parallel to that. What I got interested in is this was the first time, so I'm going to say it just straight up, the first time that I could see the energy in the bowl. On the inside, it was bubbling. On the outside, it still expanded. That sound is going, I can't see that. I can feel it through the vibration to a certain degree, but I can't see it. But here, it was like I could suddenly see the energy field. And I go back to this conversation here. This comes back up again. And I'm thinking, how interestingly parallel these conversations produce a certain energy. How much energy? Well, this becomes sort of interesting. Let's see if we can show you a natural frequency of a different sort. Anybody know the Tacoma Bridge in Seattle? Late 1950s. Wind patterns. Not a hurricane, not a breeze, but a natural frequency that started to come together, and this bridge was not prepared to handle the energy that was unleashed by the vibrations emergent in that setting. Boom. Explosive energy. For me, the water experience was an almost literal insight, not metaphoric. I felt as if I could see and touch this kind of energy, and I wondered how we might have that same sort of thing if we were able to visualize it in terms of the way conflict, and in particular, constructive change emergent in conflict might happen. Two things I've noticed about common metaphors around conflict is that they often revert to things related to sound. So, for example, the most common thing I hear across 30 years of work in settings of war, violent conflict, is that when you talk to people and you ask them, what do you think about the national peace process? Or what do you think about national reconciliation? They will often say, we don't have a voice in that. It's out there, it's distant. It's other people that are doing it. One of the metaphors of conflict is often voicelessness. It comes from a sense, especially around violence, of feeling numbed. That's a word people often use. I feel numb. I can't feel. I remember in Northern Ireland one time when Carol Kane was working after the Omagh bombing, and she had that extraordinary process of taking the flowers from the square that had been left around the Omagh bombing and working with people from the community to mix what would become murals of paper from the remains of the flowers. And that one of the older men who had lost his wife months earlier in that bombing said, "For months I have not been able to feel, but when I dipped my hands in this mush, I felt again. Powerful. So one of the things we have is that people feel voiceless. Now, we usually translate voice to power. That is, that they don't feel they have power. But there's something deeper with this use of the word voice than just power. It's about touching a deeper part of one's essence. It's about feeling connected to a wider environment. It's about being located again, very much like the Aboriginals. But it's also about feeling human again. Feeling human, feeling like a person. This was a word we heard a lot in northern Uganda. Sister Mary Tarcisia worked a lot with women child soldiers and recuperating them out of having been kidnapped, having been made slaves of the commanders, having themselves participated in fighting. She would say, our work is to help them feel like a person again. Person. Personare. Oh, Greek, the mask through which we speak. Oh, Latin, son, sound. Person. We are living in and we are vibrating beings. The second feeling, metaphorically captured in conflict, is the exact opposite. And that is the sensation of being overwhelmed by noise. By noise. The spaces are filled with loud demands. Demands for loyalty. Demands for one way to see things. Demands for what should be done. These are often competing and exclusive demands. Lurid discourse. Loudly expressed truths. It is, if you will, think about living permanently in a room where on one side of the room you have Fox News and on the other side you have NBC, and they're loud and they're going at it and you're sitting in the room and your sensation is of being overwhelmed by noise. Noise is also sound, but it's not resonance. It's not connection. So I began to wonder about these things. What would happen if we understood that social change, constructive social change, actually emulates the way sound functions? One of my curiosities. It's one of the things I started to explore with this crazy bowl. Well, you could sort of see it in a variety of the things that happen in communities like this one. You can begin to see how it's a space that's safe, it's gathered. When people speak, they speak in a way that is emergent. They touch a sense of their voice, but they also begin to attend to other voices that are there. Some interesting things that come out of that. If this were the bowl and this were the water and it was bubbling, can you imagine if we were able to visualize the energy flowing in a collective that's trying to converse about things that matter? We may call that resonance. We may call it a meaningful conversation. Would we be bold enough to call it love? So a few conclusions here. Let me just reiterate 3 of the key metaphors that I've understood from this kind of an approach and how they may relate. The first of sound as based in vibration. I think it has a lot to do with how meaningful conversation emerges. The first thing we've noticed about vibration and sound, as we put in our book more directly, was that there's a proxemics to conversation. I was fascinated yesterday to hear several of the speakers mention proximity. They mentioned it in a little different nuance, but it has a lot of parallel. I'm using the word from anthropology. Anthropology uses the word proxemics to study how cultures feel about space between people, how close is appropriate. So if I had a good German or Swiss friend up here, we would stand at a kind of a nice, good distance, right? And if I'm with the Minister of Education in Tajikistan and he's holding my hand and we're walking down the street and we're swinging and talking and I'm thinking, would my classmates love to see this? You know, there's a kind of a proxemics about what's close and what distance you need that anthropologists study. It's a very interesting subfield. And what I was asking is, there are proxemics to things like reconciliation or peace. Because what was I always hearing? It's too distant. It's too far away. That our voice enters a space that can't be heard. We hear them over a TV, but it doesn't have a way that it's actually a conversation. It's too distant. So we started to coin this little term that we were interested in, that maybe healing and reconciliation need a preferential option for the community. A little phrase we pulled. Preferential option for the community means that the container has to be proximate enough that people actually hear each other. They actually hear each other. They're within speaking range. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that national reconciliation requires the whole nation to do it. Now, this becomes very intriguing. So what we found was that the more abstract it became, and it's often manipulated when it becomes national reconciliation, the more distant it feels. And that there's a certain proxemics needed. The second that we noticed was this notion about voice. And I think the key is really this. Voice is about the essence of me, finding a way to touch the essence of you. To be in touch. I started noticing, I'm always interested in poetry in all kinds of ways, but I noticed how often I signed my emails, stay in touch. And so I started thinking about, that's kind of a wonderful little phrase, stay in touch, stay in touch. Stay in touch with who, with what? Stay in touch with yourself, stay in touch with me, stay in touch with others, stay in touch. That is somehow the deeper root where people gravitate to. And when that happens, I think that we get a sense of shared humanity. We get a sense that we're people together. Come back to two of the words we've heard a lot this weekend, safe and seen. We're visible. We're not like what Judy Atkinson wrote of the Aboriginals, present but invisible. We're seen. We're held. It's safe. Even with, and here's the challenge, in the presence of our enemies. Ooh, that's a big one. I noticed over the last weeks, the third phenomena has jumped up quite a bit. It's around the idea of echo. That conversations that are meaningful create ripples. That's the way we would talk about it. They start to ripple out into other levels and relationships and contexts. Kind of like this bowl. It's happening here, but it's rippling way out across there. The word echo is an interesting one, so let me digress for just a minute or two. Echo comes from Greek, and it was actually from Greek mythology. And the nymph Echo. The gods apparently didn't like how much this dear woman was talking. And so they cursed her. And the curse was that she could only repeat what other people said. She couldn't originate. She couldn't originate an idea. And it was a curse. I find this curse all the time in conflict. Little blocks of in-group people that all say the same things over and over again and have so little space to set out of, to say something different unless it would come under suspicion. But there's another use of echo over the years that has emerged, which is more about social echo, the rippling effect, the wave effect that actually approximates very much what we're talking about in sound. If you wanted to see this in the last few weeks, I found it very fascinating. I don't know how well that picture comes across because it's a bit distant. This is Tahrir Square in Egypt. We've been hearing this phrase a lot in the last month and a half, the ripple effect, how things are moving across the Middle East. And what's interesting, of course, is some of these are all three of what I'm talking about. Proximity. While it was national, people gravitated to find each other in the square. This is the Tahrir Square, the place that most gathered. They found a sense of voice. Something began to emerge. It was, to use the word from yesterday, emergent. But that emergent quality rippled beyond borders. I think we find some of the very things that help us define what meaningful might mean. If we were to go back to our photo of this group in Nepal, their survival is at question here. One or more of these groups may not have access to the land they need, may not have access to the forest. So how did these two young people frame the question that they were bringing for this group to talk about? It was very interesting. They said, as they opened up, we're here today to talk about this. How can we protect the forest and make sure everybody eats and survives? Oh, how interesting. How do we protect the forest and make sure everybody eats and survives? There's a certain element of meaningfulness that touches on things that really matter. It's a certain level of meaningfulness when people are able to touch the essence of who they are, and when they're able to do that safely in a space, even with those they may fear. And when that happens, what you found emergent here was that a group is basically saying, we think we can learn to live by the principle of sharing. We don't know how exactly, but that's our goal. And it includes all of us, not just some of us. Out of that, they began to, by my view, embody this conversation. It becomes a part of their wider community. And I think this is the term that when Dan Siegel yesterday referred to a client who said, I felt. That it's very much about this kind of a space where these kinds of energies are resonating. And I think that becomes what I would refer to as the embodied narrative of care. Embodying the story of care. We care for each other. And this, at its deepest level, I think, is the spirituality of transformation. Spirituality of transformation is that constructive change emerges around and out from a quality of safe space, these containers that care for self, community, and creation. If this exists, it may on occasion move like Tahrir Square, rapidly. But it's more likely to move like it has in Kailali, in Kanchanpur, Sarlahi. It moves by word of mouth, little by little, out and back, doing it again, over and again. And this, I think, to conclude, begins to create the bridge between attachment theory and conflict transformation. I think that bridge is love. So let me conclude with several thoughts about these two terms, bridge and love. Love, like the soul, has depth. It is not a surface quality that has immediate clarity. It's ineffable. We cannot physically see love by the naked eye. Yet, as the simple experiments that Bowlby did we recognize when it is missing. That was the starting point. And if we begin to have the perceptive capacity to notice how love holds, touches, and births, it is, in fact, simultaneously about holding a safe space, the bubbling and the rippling inside the space, the rise of resonance and expansion out into the world, but one that needs constant nurturing. If not nurtured, it decrescendos. Love embodies the felt vibration of shared humanity. The bridge to which I refer is not like the Tacoma Bridge that spreads out across a river. No, I think it's more like the edge of this bowl. The edge of the bowl, the sort of marking spaces of the inner and the outer worlds. Or if you want a different metaphor, an inlet at the sea, salt and fresh water moving seamlessly back and forth. It's more like that kind of a thin membrane. Anthropologists call this place, this edge, liminal. It's a word that comes from Latin, and it means threshold, to be on the threshold. A threshold is the space between the inner and outer world. It's the quality of dwelling on the threshold is one of great vulnerability because you're neither quite fully in or out, you're both. And it's movement between. And we notice, of course, that the anthropologists first explored this in reference to ritual. And their view of ritual is that it's not inherently conservative to conserve things. It's inherently about birthing things. It births things. And when you're birthed, it's an act of creativity and an act of vulnerability. You're naked. We all came out butt naked. So birthing is always creativity and vulnerability. Right? Vulnerability has a very interesting Latin root, vulneris, which means wound. I think a lot about vulnerability is how we carry our wounds with each other, how we are present for and with the wounds that we have, and in so doing, how healing may be emergent. So maybe more than a bridge, it's more like a portal, a pathway between attachment and conflict transformation, in which we can visualize this notion of an inner world bubbling and the waves that connect and come back. I think Dan would have referred to this as energy flow. I could actually visualize some of that energy flow when I saw water in the bowl. And in that way, it's embodied. Becomes attunement. It's a term that they use a lot. It's a musical term. We attune to each other. And that those may, in fact, be the invisible workings of love. Love, I believe, is about finding our way back to humanity, to feeling like a whole person in caring relationships, to live in a healthy community of people unfolding, not unfolded, unfolding. Our teachings from this particular community here, I think, point this direction. So I'd like to conclude with one observation. The most complete understanding of this love in the Anabaptist faith tradition boiled down to this invisible yet felt vibration of care. And that was very simply to notice the life of Jesus, who lived his own words. Love your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. That's not a quote from Dan Siegel, by the way. So I'll say it again. Love your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. The narrative of care. Where did I learn this first? Sunday school. singing. I always wanted to be Ken Naff singer, so now I get to try. I'd like you to join me. I want to sing two little ditties. I think a lot of you will know them. But I'd like you to, for the first time maybe, pay attention to these ditties in a new way, given the context of our conversation. Are you ready? Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. Now, the brilliant author of this song did not write, shallow and narrow, only for me and my little group who all think the same together every Sunday. All right? So, now, what is this deep and wide? Okay, this is what we learned in Sunday school. This is what we learned in Sunday school, deep and wide. Well, it's the fountain, right? It's God's love, but it's the way we participate also in that. 2, Jesus loves the little children. This is great, Ken. All the children of the world. Red, brown, yellow, black, and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Now, the brilliant author of this song did not go on to write verse 2, which basically is, why do we stop loving people when they become adults? The basic lesson was what? We are the creation and children of an extraordinary gift. This creation and under the arms of a loving Creator. We are children, loved equally. But we get our, as they say in Ireland, our knickers in a twist. As soon as it comes to the point where we get into adulthood, and then we forget that we're all children. So a small reminder. I think that's the essence of this. We learned it in some ways a long time ago. Love has this threshold quality. It emanates from the threshold, the edges that open the imagination of our connectedness, embodies a narrative of care, vibrates the undulations, the waves that penetrate, touch, yet surround our very experience. And it is on this edge that we find the unending circling journey, the one that leads ever in and ever out, winds like a path ever on, the path that we follow to find our way back to being fully human in healthy communities. And then we circle and do it again, and again, and again.